Good afternoon. I'm Anthea Lavallee, Executive Director of the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation. I'm also the co-founder of the Emerging Climate Leaders Collaborative, or ECLC. ECLC is a partnership among the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation, the League of Conservation Voters, Sustainable Futures Consulting, and the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College. For the past 5 years, this group of us has been co-hosting public climate and clean energy events that bring young people into conversation with environmental decision makers. Sometimes this has included US presidential candidates, congressional representatives, White House officials, corporate sustainability champions, among many other leaders. The last public event that we co-hosted was in January of this year in Concord, New Hampshire, just days before the New Hampshire presidential primary. Dr. Jean E. Likens, whom you'll meet in a moment, kicked off that event, recalling how he, when he was just in his 20s, co-discovered acid rain in North America at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in New Hampshire. This scientific discovery ultimately led to the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments that protect the air we breathe and the water we drink every day. Also in January in the auditorium was Michael Kranish, political investigative reporter from the Washington Post. Michael wrote an incredible essay about the event, but more specifically about the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 as an example of bipartisan policy. In this essay, Michael asked an important question. If lawmakers, Democrats and Republicans, could come together around shared environmental values in 1990, why can't we rally around climate solutions today? Well, my co-hosts and I thought a lot about that question, and we decided to go right to the source by reconvening the champions of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments to understand how and why they worked so effectively across sectors and the aisle. This is also a two-part panel event today, and we'll be hearing from young environmental leaders from all walks of life and with different politics, but with a shared commitment to their sustainable environmental future. So here we are. Our goal today is to take wisdom from our elders and hope from the leaders of tomorrow to inspire collaborative climate action now. Thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to ask questions by submitting them using the Q&A function. If we have time, we'll slide those questions to the moderators as we go along. And now I'm happy to turn the webinar over to co-host Dr. Geoffrey Parker from Dartmouth College.
Thank you, Anthea. I'm Geoff Parker, Interim Faculty Director at the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy Society, and also a professor of engineering at Dartmouth College. And we're just thrilled to co-sponsor this event. It lines up really well against our mission at the Irving Institute, which is to accelerate an affordable, reliable, and equitable transition to a low and no carbon energy future. Achieving this transition will require innovative policies that promote the development and deployment of clean energy technology, and policies that, to endure, will have to have bipartisan support. So it's particularly inspiring to reflect on the most significant bipartisan successes of the past, such as achieving the 1998 Clean Air Act amendments that Anthea referred to, as we look to shape strategies for a sustainable future. So we're honored to learn from the original champions and looking forward to hearing from the next generation of environmental leaders who will help apply those lessons and hopefully move this ball forward.
Thank you so much, Geoff. Senate Majority Leader in 1990, George Mitchell, couldn't be with us here today, although he had hoped to be. But he did sit down for a Zoom interview with me and my colleague Ann Tart in August, and I'm happy now to share Senator Mitchell's remarks in this 2-minute video.
the very start of his Senate career in 1980, Maine's George Mitchell provided scientists a platform to enlighten congressional lawmakers about threats to the environment.
We held a whole series of hearings throughout the 1980s, and we created a forum for scientists to come forward with their views to determine whether air pollution had to be dealt with through expansion and extension of the provisions of the Clean Air Act. Science, the science had developed over the course of the decade between 1980 and 1990, and as the evidence grew, the strength of the arguments grew.
As Senate Majority Leader in 1990, Mitchell was instrumental in the passage of the Clean Air Act amendments.
It was a fully bipartisan effort. Lots of people participated. I had a complete and total trust in other senators who were very active in this. We had a lot of trust that had been built up over a long period of time, and it was a remarkable effort and remarkably successful. It would not have happened but for the cooperation between and the leadership demonstrated by Republicans and the Democrats in the Senate.
Mitchell's leadership in securing bipartisan support made these amendments one of the most significant environmental laws in American history, targeting acid rain, urban air pollution, and toxic emissions.
We have to try to do the same now. We have to heed science. We cannot deny science. We have to act in a proper way. Climate change is here. It's getting worse, and I think we have an obligation to deal with it in behalf of our own people, the people we represent and participate in representing, and people all around the world.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Rob Werner. I'm the state director here in New Hampshire for the League of Conservation Voters, and we're very happy that you've joined us for this program. I have the honor of introducing our moderator for the first section of our program today, Chelsea Henderson. She has a lot of experience on Capitol Hill and is the author of a book that came out this year called Glacial. And I'll just read a little bit from the jacket of the book. It said, "It took nearly 60 years for a meaningful climate change bill to run the political gauntlet from Capitol Hill to the Oval Office. Why?" And I've been reading this book. It's quite interesting, gives you a lot of history in terms of why it has taken so long, the twists and turns, the policies, the debates, and so forth. But I want to tell you a little bit about Chelsea. She has worked in environmental policy on Capitol Hill for more than 25 years, seeking bipartisan solutions to the threats of climate change. Currently, Chelsea hosts the environmental podcast Eco Right Speaks and consults on pro-climate solutions for Washington-based advocacy groups. Her op-eds in support of clean energy and robust climate change solutions have been published in The Hill, Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, and other publications. Chelsea lives, works, and raises her two sons in the Washington, D.C. metro area. So thanks again, Chelsea, for joining us to moderate this first part of the program today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I need to update it because my sons have flown the nest and I'm now an empty nester, so I don't have to raise them anymore, which is fantastic. But welcome, everyone. As Rob said, my name is Chelsea Henderson. I am the author of Glacial, the Inside Story of Climate Politics. This book is a look back of the nearly 60 years from when LBJ first learned about the so-called greenhouse effect and its potentially devastating impacts that we would be experiencing in the 21st century, to all the way forward to the signing of the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, which I really see as a down payment on U.S. climate action. I welcome today's panelists who are here to offer reflections and insights from their experience in the passage of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. I'm not just an author, I'm a recovering Senate staffer who had the great privilege of working on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And this bill, passage of the Clean Air Act amendments, back when I first was a young staffer starting off and today, still heralded as a great example of bipartisan cooperation that broke a long-standing stalemate between those wanting to see the Clean Air Act strengthened to deal with the issues of the day, such as acid rain and ozone depletion, with those wanting to protect and preserve America's manufacturing sector. So sort of the classic environment versus the economy situation. Today's panelists were present in varying capacities for this debate, and I welcome them and their perspectives on effectively achieving overwhelming bipartisan support. They made it look easy, but I can assure you that it wasn't. So joining us today, Senator Max Baucus is a former Democratic U.S. Senator from Montana who served from 1978 to 2014 and was a key architect of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. He also chaired the Senate Finance Committee, shaping major tax and healthcare legislation, including the Affordable Care Act. After retiring from the Senate, he served as U.S. Ambassador to China and is known throughout his career for his pragmatic bipartisan approach. Only people retiring from the Senate, by the way, go on and take other jobs, but we'll table that for now. Michael Kranish is a political reporter for the Washington Post. He co-authored Trump Revealed and John F. Kerry, The Complete Biography, and contributed to Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting on the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. He is known for his historical insights and investigative journalism on American politics and power, and joins this panel to reflect on his work in the Washington, D.C. Bureau of the Boston Globe from 1984 to 2015. Dr. Gene Likens is a pioneering ecologist best known for co-discovering acid rain in North America in the 1960s. Dr. Likens' long-term research at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, initiated in 1963, drove public awareness and led to the 1990 passage of the Clean Air Act amendments and its stricter air pollution controls. He is the founding director of the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies and has received numerous honors, including the National Medal of Science, for his contributions to ecosystem science and environmental advocacy. And last but not least, Roger Porter is the IBM Professor of Business and Government at Harvard University. He served for more than 11 years in senior economic policy positions in the Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush administrations. As assistant to the President for Economic and Domestic Policy from 1989 to 1993, he had the responsibility for developing the President's Clean Air Act proposal and its negotiations with Congress. So welcome to you all. And with that, I am going to turn the floor over to Senator Baucus for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Chelsea. I'll be brief about 4 points. Number one, we had a great precedent and momentum leading up to the 1990 amendments. That is, we had passed the Clean Water Act, which worked pretty well. EPW committee, Congress, the country knew that if we could pass the Clean Water Act, perhaps we could do something about air. And we had a problem clearly with air. Acid rain was very much in the press. I never forget reading lots of articles about acid rain, how not nitrogen oxides and carbon sulfur dioxides from power plants to the Midwest, flowing eastward to New England, dumping on acid rain on defoliating forests, et cetera. So it was very much in the press, and it's visual. You can see acid rain. It really helps. It's not an abstraction. It was visual. Second, and add to that, we had ozone depletion, stratospheric ozone depletion. People knew that chlorofluorocarbons and air conditioners were depleting the ozone layer, and all that radiation now is coming down the Earth. It was pretty visual too. You could conceive a hole in the stratospheric ozone level. So we had things going for us. Number two, which is most striking to me, was the good faith of all the participants. We all wanted to address the problems our country is facing, whether it's automobile tailpipe emissions, lower level ozone, or whether it was stationary source emissions, nitrogen oxides and soda oxides from the power plants, et cetera. Very much good faith. And President Bush George H. Bush was one of the participants. He signaled he'd agree to work with the Congress passing the Clean Air Act. A disparate bunch of people, like Chafee and Mitchell from New England, really cared about the environment. And they're both very pragmatic, decent, hardworking people. And Alan Simpson, he real power in the Senate. He too wanted to work pass the Clean Air Act. It's been referenced before because Western coal is low sulfur coal. and that was part of the solution. That worked really well. Robert Byrd was a bit of a stickler. He was difficult. Appalachian coal was a bit difficult, but he knew that there was going to be a Clean Air Act. He could see it coming. And then of course, Pete Domenici, who was kind of key at the end for cap and trade. So number two, again, it's just a good faith, which led to something else, which I think is not really understood and appreciated. This was a bottom-up bill. It was not a top-down bill. By bottom-up, I mean members of the Congress, EPW committee, Chelsea, you know, and others worked really hard to fashion a bill. There are lots of amendments. The same thing happened over in the House. It's a bottom-up bill, so there's ownership by members of the House and Senate after compromise, and it's so important. I contrast it with, frankly, Hillary Clinton's Hillary Care. It's a different subject, but it's illustrative. But that was a top-down bill, and it didn't pass. We in the Congress then worked really hard on the ACA. That's a bottom-up bill. So bottom-up bills do have a lot more credibility and are more sustainable. And I think that's one thing we have to work on in the future with climate and other issues. Is more bottom-up. Committee chairmen have more power, less with reconciliation, less top-down stuff, because that really makes things very, very, very difficult. And also, because we're working together in good faith, we tried out new ideas. I mean, that's kind of my third point. A lot of environmentalists said, okay, we got to clamp down the emissions on the power plants, you know, the technology restrictions. But that was so much opposed by the industry. So we came up with cap and trade. The cap and trade was really the key that unlocked a lot, allowed the passage of the Clean Air Act. I remember I was sitting in a room, in a back room with the conference between the House, the Senate, and the bill, and Domenici finally agreed, okay, let's do a cap and trade. And Boyd and Gray in the White House was very helpful there too, sitting in the room. It was just everybody working together. It was a new idea. It wasn't an old idea, it was a new idea. And after that, there was no politics. Here I was up for re-election that year. Any mischievous Republican could have caused me a lot of problems back in my home state in Montana. To be honest, I didn't even realize that the Clean Air Act potentially could be an issue in Montana. I was working so hard to make sure we passed the law. So back then there was no politics as there is today, unfortunately. And after that, I want to add is we had terrific staff, really good staff. I'm thinking of Kate Kimball worked, I think, for Mitchell or Schaefer, and then Chelsea, you remember, and you two and others. They were really, really good. And I mention all this because I think it's a key for younger people. Younger people may want to be a member of the House, maybe want to be a member of the Senate. That's a little bit of a reach sometimes. But a younger person can work on the staff of a key committee and make a huge difference. We rely so much on staff, and it's really important. And I've got another point, basically, and George Mitchell mentioned it, and you too, I think, did, Chelsea. That's science. We relied on science. We did our best to determine what the scientists said. What we did, and nobody disputed the science. We listened to the experts, and we made our decisions what we thought made sense. So it was a real wonderful time, working hard. And we had to, as I was chairman of subcommittee chairman, effective chairman of the full committee, because Quentin Burdick basically turned things over to me. But after we worked out a compromise and worked on the floor, I had to vote against my own amendments. So did George Mitchell, in order to keep the compromise. Senator Lieberman took amendments from my bill. They're more pro-environment. I had to vote against them to keep the compromise. I had to vote against Robert Byrd. Robert Byrd is no longer a leader, but he was chairman of the Appropriations Committee. Nobody wanted to cross Robert Byrd, but I had to vote against one of his amendments on the floor. Afterwards, he walked up to me and said, "That was a mistake, Max." In the better sense of things, it was the right thing to do. Yeah. And eventually things passed. So all this, and they need to get, Dingle and Waxman. Waxman represents California. All those tailpipes folks worried about emissions coming out of cars. then Dago, represents the state that makes the cars. And they finally worked it out. And there's this big thing: should there be two sets of rules, a California standard versus a national standard? And finally, we worked to compromise that out too. And so my main point is, it was a wonderful time. All members worked together. It was good faith. It was not personal. Nobody questioned the motives of others. And I think a key is because we had a problem we had to address. Number two is bottom up, not top down. We worked together to get the job done. So anyway, thanks for
Senator, thank you for setting that stage. I mean, I think you just captured so perfectly that it was definitely a different era where you were relying on science, you were working together to address a problem and not to just make a soundbite, right, for the news. And we'll get to the media component of this. I wanted to turn the floor over to Mr. Porter to hear a little bit from him on his reflections on this time period working for President Bush.
Well, thank you very much. It's a delight for me to be with you on this subject and this distinguished panel. And I would underscore Senator Baucus's references to the key feature of people in both the executive and legislative branches. George H.W. Bush, in running for president when as vice president, was asked in what ways would his administration be different from his predecessors, and he said, I want to be known as the environmental president, the education president, and I want a kinder, gentler America. So when he very first came into office, he asked me to head up the task force to develop an administration proposal. And we began by assembling a task force from all across the administration, which had a lot of departments and agencies with a vested stake in the issue. And then went up and held, before we started developing our proposals, a series of meetings, more than a dozen and a half, with members of the House and Senate, Republican and Democrat, asking them basically two questions. One, what are the things that you think are most important that need to be in the legislation? And two, what are your greatest fears of things that could be in the bill that would cause you heartburn? Based on that, we also had more than a score of meetings with organized interest groups, large numbers of environmental organizations, the oil and gas industry, the automotive industry, the farmers, the coal industry, etc. Again, asking them those questions. So by the time we came later that spring to developing the administration's proposals, we had a large number of ideas that gave us an opportunity to map not only substantive reality, but political reality. The president ultimately advanced a several hundred-page bill, which went to the House and the Senate. The Senate took it up, the Environment and Public Works Committee, where Senator Baucus was a key figure. And when they produced their bill, the Environment and Public Works Committee bill, Senator Mitchell did something very interesting. He went to Senator Dole and said, I don't think it's going to be possible to get 60 votes for the Environment and Public Works Committee bill or for the administration's bill. Would you join me in going to the president and proposing a negotiation? I will agree to produce a majority of Democrat senators. Senator Dole, you will agree to produce a majority of Republican senators, and the president will sign on to an agreement that we will have negotiated together. There followed over 130 hours of negotiations, often late into the night, going through the bill provision by provision and producing ultimately what was called the Administration Leadership Agreement that I think was superior in quality to either the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee bill or the administration's bill. A lot of hard work went into it. And it has been pointed out, Chelsea, this is the bill on final passage that cleared the Senate 89-11 and the House 401-21. Quite a singular accomplishment for a piece of legislation that had been gridlocked for a number of years. I would simply add the following. In Washington, policy successes are always the product of many hands. This was a bill that benefited from having a large amount of participation from people who felt their ideas were genuinely being considered. It benefited enormously from science. We had the National Acidic Precipitation Assessment Program for 10 years, costing over $500 million studying acid rain. So we had a great scientific foundation on which to begin it. And then third and not least, the process focused on finding common ground rather than winning arguments with one another. And I think that search for finding common ground based on science and with large amounts of participation was really key to the success of the bill.
Well, thank you for that. I'm sensing some common themes for sure between your comments and Senator Baucus, including science. So let's turn the floor over to Dr. Likens.
Thank you, Chelsea. A great pleasure to be a part of this event. The acid rain initiative that began at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, as Anthea mentioned at the beginning, was something that was a great surprise to us. The very first sample of rain that we collected in 1963, when we began the project, was about 100 times more acidic than we thought it should be, although we didn't know what it should be because there weren't other data available that we could use for reference. So we were puzzled. Where did this come from? How long had it been that acidic? What was causing the acidity? Was it causing any ecological harm to the system that we were studying? We didn't know any of those answers. And so that set out a long period of study for discovering what the effects of the acidity were that were falling on our landscape. This required that we produce, and I think this is a really important point, that as scientists, the data that we collect and make publicly available need to be impeccable. They need to be ready and able to resist all claims of misuse or misaccuracy or whatever term you might like to use. That's a problem that is said so much these days, and these data that we were collecting at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest were attacked. They were attacked in many ways and in many forms, but they withstood those attacks, and the long-term data that we have now collected, something like 62 years of continuous data on this issue, show that the effect of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, which focused for the first time specifically on acid rain, and the 1970 Clean Air Act itself have been very important in reducing the acidity of precipitation at Hubbard Brook by about 84%. So this is a real environmental success story where we've reduced the acidity to a point where it's now much less toxic to the systems that it's falling on. It's still more acidic than it should be, but the reduction is a huge environmental success story. The impact of that success story is very important because it's rare to have an environmental success story of that sort, of that magnitude. Others we might think about would be DDT or lead in gasoline in particular. But this one is particularly important, and because of it's being produced primarily by power plants in the Midwest, and then those emissions, those toxic emissions, are being carried eastward and fall on the landscape in New England, southeastern Canada, and the eastern United States. This creates a problem that needs to be resolved in a more holistic way. So, as Roger just mentioned, the more almost unanimous, it wasn't, but almost unanimous vote from the House and the Senate in passing the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments caused the federal government to act and to produce the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. It wouldn't have happened state by state because the states where the emissions were occurring would not have been in favor of it. I think it's fair to say. A couple other points. Senator Backus mentioned in the beginning about the visibility. One of the things that we did early on when we published our first papers on acid rain was to entice other scientists to collect the chemistry of precipitation, its acidity, and that allowed us to generate maps. So we could generate a map for 1975 for the eastern United States, and then another one for 1985, and another one for 1995. And they showed not only the intensity of acidity of rain and snow in that area, but that it was expanding in size. So this was easy to grasp. This scientific information was easy to grasp and to understand and to say, oh, wow, yeah, I can see how that's working. That's not good. Another factor that I think was very important, and this has been written about, is the effect of cartoons. There were many, many cartoons during this period of dealing with acid rain, many of them in the news media. One of my favorites is of a man holding a skeleton of a fish, and underneath the caption says, acid rain got to it before I did. Well, that isn't quite correct. I mean, acid rain was never strong enough to dissolve away the meat of a big fish. If anything, it might have dissolved the bones of the fish, but it didn't do either. But the cartoon, the satire of the cartoon, and there were many, many of them that conveyed the message, the complicated scientific message about what was going on and that something needed to be done about it. So I think that was another feature of the dealing with the problem and producing the Clean Air Act amendments. I recall, because I was so heavily involved in the issue at that time, I'm not a politician, but I recall President George H. Bush saying when he was elected, one of the very first things he said publicly is, we need to deal with this environmental problem. And they did. Cap and trade was mentioned. I think cap and trade, which initially was proposed by the Environmental Defense Fund, was something that was very important in promoting action on the issue. So an environmental success story, one of the few, and I'm very proud to have been involved in it from the beginning until now. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, the storyteller amongst us, Mr. Kranish.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thanks for inviting me to talk to this panel and talk to the people who are in the audience, especially the younger individuals who might wonder, can Congress get anything done? This is not just a story of history, but it really is a template for how two sides can come together, because it was not preordained. There had been efforts time and again. Very briefly, my involvement with this was, I was a reporter at the Boston Globe in the New Hampshire Bureau in the early 80s, and acid rain was a huge issue in the state. The state at that time was very conservative. Its governor was the elder Governor John Sununu, and he made an issue of saying that he was going to deal with this, and he passed and later signed legislation. And then several years later, I was in the Boston Globe's Washington Bureau, and John Sununu was then the chief of staff at the White House. And this was before Congress. So I went to my editors and I said, this is the most important bill before Congress affecting New England. And can I spend the entire year not just covering the committee hearings, which frankly are not my favorite thing to do, but to go around relevant parts of the country and explain to readers what's going on, why this is an important bill, whatever your views might be politically, what's actually happening. So they said, sure. And I went to a pond on a mountain in Vermont that it was being killed by acid rain. I went to the dirtiest power plant in Ohio. And I did that again and again, and also covered day to day what was going on in the White House. I remember many conversations with Roger Porter from this panel, many conversations, and dozens, if not 100, seems like, with George Mitchell, and many other leaders from that time. And I remember Senator Baucus dealing with this. Even Mitch McConnell, who is today is the minority leader from Kentucky, and then was senator from Kentucky. Even he ended up supporting this because it was clear, and I think Senator Baucus mentioned bottom up. This was from the bottom up of the voters as well. This was something that there was so much concern about this issue, and a lot of reporting, frankly, on this issue, that when it came time for the New Hampshire primary, Republican candidates, not just Democrats, were falling over themselves to say, no, I'm going to be the one to deal with acid rain and clean air. So there really was this impulse politically to do it. George H.W. Bush, who I interviewed numerous times and did follow-up where I talked with him by email about the impact of this, he considered himself a conservationist, and he thought that he had almost a religious duty to deal with this issue. So he was very on board. He heard that from Sununu. Politically, it was important. I heard it from a lot of other people that he knew. He heard it from, I believe, Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister of Canada, which was also affected by emissions from the Midwest in the U.S. So there just was this perfect storm, terrible analogy on this day coming together, that there could be, near unanimous. It's almost unheard of. There were a few people who were against it, and sometimes these were Democrats from coal states. But as I mentioned, even a coal state Republican ended up being a crucial supporter. So from my coverage, what I was there as a very young reporter covering Congress. And to me, I thought, well, this is the way they really get things done. There are two sides or different positions to begin with. Democrats wanted what they called command and control to basically force a cap on emissions that were causing acid rain. And Republicans, the White House, embraced this free market approach of cap and trade. And as Roger mentioned, they found this middle ground that ended up, by most accounts, being really more effective because they really did work together. To bring it to the more current day, some years later, and John Kerry's not on this panel, but who as Chelsea mentioned, I co-authored a biography of him. He was also instrumental in the acid rain part of this. And then later on, he tried to deal with climate change using the Republican template of cap and trade. But by that time, politics were so divided that he just found it impossible, and they did not get it done. They didn't, maybe it's something the panelists want to talk about, but during the 1990s discussion, there was discussion of climate change. It was usually referred to as greenhouse gas effect, but there just wasn't the political muscle to get that part of it included. Some people wish that it had, but it was not the key focus. It certainly was something that everyone was aware of and was talking about. But that seemed to be a step too far, and to this day, you really haven't been able to take that step. So I don't know if we'll be able to get back to that moment where there really can be a bipartisan effort. But if there is, it'd probably be based on what happened in the 1990 Act.
One thing that I think is really interesting, because you have all touched on the same themes. So we had a reliance on science, which today, right, even as a Category 5 hurricane is barreling to the state of Florida and probably going to cause significant death and damage, people continue to deny climate science in a way that it sounds like you were able to overcome in 1990 any attacks that were being made on the data. But also, I think we digested news differently in the 80s and 90s. I remember as a kid growing up watching World News Tonight with Peter Jennings with my parents. You had the evening news and you had the newspaper. So, Michael, given this shift in how we digest media, how do you think that influences the politics and probably actually contributed to the deepening of our political divide?
Well, there certainly were a number of industry people who thought this was a terrible idea. American Electric Power, if I got the name right, they fought very hard against it because their interests were so much at stake. Eventually, there was just such overwhelming support. I think today, I mean, there weren't people at that time saying, as I recall it, acid rain is a hoax or climate change is a hoax. There was this agreement that it's a problem, and the issue was how do we deal with it? Another piece of legislation, I think it was the same year or nearly the same year, was the Disabilities Act that Bob Dole had championed, and I did a story about how a follow-up effort to pass a treaty on disabilities went nowhere. And I went to see Bob Dole, who I covered extensively when he was in Congress, and I said, why is it that you could get Clean Air and Disabilities Act passed, pretty easily? In retrospect, it wasn't easy at the time, but you can't get a treaty that wouldn't cost the U.S. a penny to be passed. And he said, well, when I went to Congress, I thought I went there to do something. If I was at 4 and you were at 2, we'd find a way to get to 3. And it does seem like the current political environment does make it much harder to even say you want to get to 3, much less get there.
That's true. Senator Baucus, something that really fascinated me about this time period, especially as I was writing Glacial, was that environmental issues weren't broken down party lines. They were more broken down by regional lines. And so I thought maybe you can touch on that and how that might have actually made it easier to strike a compromise because people weren't just spouting the talking points that their political party apparatus gave them, but they had a real vested interest in seeing their region solve a problem.
Well, regions are important. For example, Robert Byrd cares about Appalachia dirty coal. Alan Simpson, Powder River Basin cleaner coal. In New England, acid rain. Electric Power Association worried about the power. So, but it is an issue. I'll go back to what I said before, which I think is quite important. If the leadership in the House and the Senate would truly go back and give committee chairmen more power, and so bills would be written in committees, not dictated to by the leadership, that would significantly help. That's hard. That's very hard. Lord Acton said power corrupts and absolute power corruptly. Leadership loves the power and they get corrupted. Now, to be honest, some of that's all the money in politics today. There's way, way too much money. Too many ads, and you touched on it. It's social media, it's internet, and we're siloed, and we're not connected as much as people. We don't watch Peter Jennings today like we once did. That's a problem. It's a real problem. But we're looking for solutions, and one solution, again, is more bottom-up stuff rather than top-down. And when on committees, members know each other. They're more friends, so they're working together.
Yeah.
Well, when it's top down, we're not doing anything together.
You're not developing those relationships or those connections that
that's
allow you to compromise with somebody, allow you to negotiate. And that's something that Senator Warner used to talk about, that you could disagree with somebody on the Senate floor and then go have dinner with them that night and still be friends. And today's political environment doesn't really allow that.
But science really is important, even way a long time. I remember sitting on a panel and listening to Jim Hansen at NOAA talk about the dramatic effects of climate change with greater oscillation and amplitudes, and the weather is just going to really go wacky and more wacky over time. And he based it on science. It was so compelling. And I'm trying to think of how we can get that out more. Jim Hansen was saying that was a long time, it was about 20 years ago. But it just, the science really is there on climate, and we have to, I hate to use this phrase, better job, but the more there's focus on science and addressing climate, the more likely it is we're going to begin to find some kind of solution. It is really hard. Clean Air Act is easy compared with climate. It's mobile sources, stationary sources, it's easy. Climate is more abstract. It's less immediate. You have to deal with other countries. Clean Air Act, basically the U.S. It's more complicated. But the key to me is really, and you, Professor Likens, help get science out more Because the more there's science out there, it's pretty hard to argue with it, really. I think that's part of the solution.
I think our time is winding down, but I did want to note that I believe it was Dr. Likens talked about how acid rain had such visual effects, right? And we know with the ozone, even though we couldn't see the so-called hole, which was really just a thinning of the ozone layer, but there was a visual, right? We could imagine the ozone layer thinning and causing skin cancer. And CO2 has been the invisible pollutant, but it's quite visible now as the science is able to connect these bigger storms like Helene and Milton, those conditions, to being more extreme due to impacts from climate change. So I do hope that future policymakers or current policymakers and the youth that are watching this will take this approach bottom up, work together, put the R and the D aside, and really work to solve problems, not just to create talking points. And I thank you all for your leadership and for the time that we had together. And hopefully we can forge a path forward on bipartisan environmental action in the future.
We have no choice.
We have no choice.
Hi, I'm Sue Kaplan, and I'm the founder of Sustainable Futures Consulting. I'm also a partner of the Emerging Climate Leaders Collaborative. After college, I worked on presidential and senatorial campaigns and then worked for 2 congressmen on the Hill. At the time, Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, a Democrat, and President Ronald Reagan, a Republican, had hard policy fights and were still able to find some commonality and even some fun together during this St. Patrick's Day. During the 2007 presidential campaigns, every Republican candidate was talking about climate change and how to do something about it. This was the era of President H.W. Bush that you just heard about. Bipartisanship was still intact. We created this forum to learn from the past. We also created this forum to highlight the brilliance, expertise, and passion of young people. I taught in the sustainability dual major at the University of New Hampshire and found just how purposeful this generation is and how they lean into the challenges we face. I am confident of these 5 young men and women for the next panel will impress us, teach us, and share their engagement with nature and environmental action. I am delighted to introduce my young friend Bi-Partisan. She was a panelist for our very first program during the presidential primary in 2020. Our team has seen her significant trajectory and know that we'll go forward. We're in good hands. Take it away, Bi.
Thank you so much, Sue. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel on youth environmental action. My name is Beatrice Burak. Some people call me B, that's fine too. I'm a senior studying history and government at Dartmouth, and I'm so excited to be moderating this panel today because my own involvement in youth environmental action inspires so much of what I do today. I've had the opportunity to work on Capitol Hill on multiple political campaigns in New Hampshire and to report on State House politics for the New Hampshire Bulletin. I've also worked as a freelance journalist covering politics and environmental issues across the state, and my work has been published in outlets like the Valley News, NHPR, and Business New Hampshire magazine. As I said, my path has really been shaped by my involvement in environmental issues, starting back when I was in high school. And Sue just mentioned this, but in 2020, I got to be involved in an event a lot like this one, set up by many of the same organizers, including Sue. And it was an event where students like me got to stand on a big stage in Concord in front of a live audience with press and cameras. This was pre-pandemic 2020. And we got to ask presidential candidates questions about environmental policy. And looking back, being able to stand on a stage with Senator Amy Klobuchar and ask her questions about carbon pricing bills, I think that was a moment that really inspired me to see myself as someone who could engage in conversations about big issues like climate change with decision makers. And I think it's so important that young people have the opportunity to see themselves as real players in this issue, an issue that in so many ways will determine our futures. So I'm really glad to be joined today by wonderful panelists Dana De La Cruz, Georgie Fisher, Eric Lyons, Isaiah Menning, and Carlos Vargas, 5 young people who all have fascinating stories to tell about their own involvement with environmental action. And I want to turn it over to them now. They're each going to have 3 minutes to tell you a little bit about themselves and how they came at this issue before I bring us back to Q&A, where I'll ask them to delve a little bit deeper into their stories. So we'll start with Dana. Dana, if you could kick us off, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, B. Hi, everyone. My name is Dana La Cruz, and I use she, they pronouns. I'm the Young Voices of Science and Community Relations Specialist at the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation. I graduated from Wellesley College with a degree in biological sciences and have had a variety of environmental research experiences across the US and Latin America. As a first-generation Mexican-American raised in Houston, Texas, one of the most diverse large cities in the US, I have witnessed firsthand the environmental challenges facing my community. Many communities located near industrial facilities are at a higher risk for respiratory problems, cancer, and other chronic conditions. These communities often include underrepresented groups, such as people of color. A report from the Environmental Integrity Project revealed that the highest concentration of smog in the Houston area are found near Latino, Black, and lower-income neighborhoods. A report by the New York City Department of Environmental Protection revealed that neighborhoods in New York City with higher populations of Black and Latino residents face significantly greater air pollution levels. According to a report from the California Air Resources Board, communities of color, particularly Latino and Black neighborhoods, experience higher levels of air pollution, primarily due to traffic and industrial emissions. I know this firsthand, as I remember seeing petrochemical plants from the football field of my high school, Cesar Chavez High School. This high school is named after civil rights activist Cesar Chavez, and it predominantly serves Hispanic, Black, and low-income students. In fact, most of the students qualify for free or reduced lunch. In the 90s, the Houston Independent School District voted to create this new school due to the overcrowding of the existing high schools. So in 1995, a group called the Unidos contra Environmental Racism protested the school's proximity to the many chemical facilities. And despite it being less than 0.25 miles from several chemical plants, my high school officially opened in 2000. As a child of immigrants, it feels especially cruel that the land we came for, the greater opportunities, is the very same land that is jeopardizing our health. My parents sought new beginnings, yet they found themselves settling in a polluted environment. This experience further proves that environmental justice and social justice are unavoidably linked. I'm committed to uplifting the voices of those on the front lines of the environmental movement, individuals who are often not responsible for the issues that they face, but bear the brunt of the consequences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana. Really appreciate you sharing your perspectives here today. And we're going to go to Georgie next.
Thanks, Bea. Hello, everyone. My name is Georgiana Fisher, and I'm one of 16 youth plaintiffs in the landmark youth climate lawsuit held v. State of Montana. This case was the first constitutional climate lawsuit in constitutional climate trial in U.S. history, coming out of a state that really has a long, complicated history with both natural resource extraction and natural resource protection. That history includes the 1972 Montana Constitutional Convention, which gave the people of Montana the right to a clean and healthful environment for present and future generations. That right, almost 50 years later, was part of what we as the young people of Montana were arguing for, that the state's government's continued promotion of fossil fuels worsens the climate crisis, which disproportionately impacts young people and violates our constitutional rights. In March of 2020, when the case was filed, I was 17, a senior in high school. I'm now 22, and I just graduated from the University of New Hampshire this past May with a degree in environmental science. I grew up in Montana, and I was lucky enough to have a childhood where I got to be outside and in the mountains. But as I grew up, I began to notice changes in these outdoor places that I loved. Less snow in the winters, more wildfires and smoke in the summers, and these prolonged droughts. I started learning about climate change in school and through the news, and by the time I was a senior in high school, I was really frustrated. I've been a competitive Nordic skier for over half my life, and in December of 2019, I was gearing up for the main season of ski races that would get me onto a college team the next year. except I was having to hop over patches of grass because Bozeman, Montana did not have enough snow in late December. This, amid other climate frustrations, drove me to write a letter to the editor of my local paper on why climate change should not be a political issue. We all have a stake in the climate crisis. It was that letter that eventually got me in touch with the lawyers at Our Children's Trust who were building this case. 3 years later, in June of 2023, I testified in front of the district court in the first constitutional climate trial in the United States. My testimony was largely centered on cross-country skiing, but I also testified about my great-grandmother who fought to protect wilderness areas in Montana and how I wanted to preserve her legacy and fight for the places she worked so hard to protect. I testified to the mental harm I faced from climate change, kind of just that weight of despair and hopelessness and uncertainty over the future. 2 months after the trial, we got our decision, which was an unequivocal ruling in our favor from the judge. If you want a crash course in climate, I would highly suggest you read that decision. That moment just gave me an unbelievable amount of hope that my generation has a voice and that this case might have the chance to make that systematic change in the world. The state has appealed the decision, and this past July, we had the oral arguments in front of the Montana Supreme Court. Regardless of the outcome of the case has already made an impact, reaching not just Montana, but really nationwide and even globally, and setting an important precedent. The courts are really an important tier of our political system, especially when it comes to youth who don't get a vote, as I couldn't when I joined this case, and who are disproportionately affected by climate change. Having a win like this in a place like Montana, which is not generally known for its climate-friendly policies, is important, but I believe the true impact of this case is really the power it gives to youth everywhere, and for that, I'm really incredibly grateful to have been a part of this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgie, for sharing that story. And I love that your grandmother was also involved in activism. You're sort of carrying on that tradition in your family. That's really wonderful. So we're going to hear next from one of our scientists. Eric, if you want to take it away and give us a bit of your story.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Lyons, and I'm currently a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Montana. I grew up in Connecticut, right near the famous Hammonasset State Park, went to school in Virginia, where I worked in a fisheries lab on the Chesapeake Bay, and then moved out to Montana in August of 2021 to hopefully get my doctorate in ecology. Right now, I'm one of the many, many scientists working within the fabled Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, and I want to thank you all for the opportunity to speak at this event. We've heard so much today about the success of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments following the discovery of acid rain and the resulting implications for human health. I'd like to use my time to instead talk about the animal side of conservation and environmental policy. So my current research mainly focuses on the survival and movement of the salamander populations within Hubbard Brook, especially the northern spring salamander. As you might have heard, amphibians are one of the most threatened taxa worldwide, with up to 40% of the species currently faced with the possibility of extinction. And most projections, like everything with climate change, think the problem's going to get worse before it gets better. We're seeing increases in the frequency and intensity of floods and other storms, heightened prevalence of diseases like chytrid or peat sow, and of course, an ever-shrinking amount of suitable habitat. But I like to think that everyone here has a fundamental appreciation of nature and for the ecosystems that surround us. Obviously, not everyone's going out and looking for salamanders in the woods in their free time, but whether you're out hunting or fishing or even just passing a fox on your drive into work, I like to think that those kinds of experiences can make us appreciate the world around us a little bit more. But the reality is that those ecosystems are rapidly changing. My salamanders can live to be almost 30 years old, but they can't read a graph. They have no idea what the streams are going to look like 10, 20, or even 30 years from now. And by the time they respond, might be too late. The onus kind of falls on us to identify these problems and figure out, well, what are we going to do? I can collect all the data and make all the models in the world saying, oh, they're probably going to move here, or this is the most important habitat to protect. But without some kind of higher level or policy level change, I might as well just be some guy in the woods flipping rocks. And realistically, the political back and forth where one party takes over and sets X regulations, followed by another party taking over and setting Y regulations, on and on every 4 years or so, is probably not going to be enough in the grand scheme of things. It's important to be able to come across the aisle and figure out real and, more importantly, long-term solutions to these kind of problems. The discovery of and subsequent response to acid rain was, as mentioned, one of the great scientific success stories. And like others have said before me, quite frankly, we could use a couple more of those. Climate change feels like one of those we really just need to get right, both for our sake and for the sake of everything else on this planet. Events like these are a great way to kind of drive that initiative forward and work towards some real and, again, long-term change. That's the end of my pitch, but I want to thank everyone here and all the other panelists for their insight and for allowing me to speak here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric, for bringing a scientist's perspective to this conversation, and we look forward to talking more about the intersection of science and policy in a bit. For now, we're going to go on to Isaiah. Isaiah, if you want to go ahead and tell us your story.
Sure, thank you, Bea. Hi, everyone. My name is Isaiah Menning. I'm a member of the Dartmouth class of 2024, and I'm the External Affairs Manager of the American Conservation Coalition, the largest conservative environmental group in the country at over 50,000 young right-of-center members across the country. Because Republicans have failed to engage on climate, conservatism and environmentalism might seem oxymoronic. I thought that when I entered Dartmouth as an undergrad. However, with the help of groups on the eco-right like ACC, I became convinced the best environmental approaches were rooted in conservative values, markets, innovation, and free economies. And I think these conservative principles are the key for the future of bipartisan environmental policy. I submit that in order for climate and environment to be bipartisan again, we must move beyond negative environmentalism that depends on government to restrict bad human action to a positive environmentalism that embraces human ingenuity, creativity, and makes it easier to build things. One of the best examples of how negative environmentalism has prevented climate action is in the environmental opposition to nuclear energy. Nuclear energy provides 24/7 carbon-free energy with lower land use impact than any energy source. According to Our World in Data, nuclear energy is tied with wind and solar as the safest energy available. In fact, nuclear energy provides 20% of total electricity in the United States and about half of the clean energy in the country. So why aren't we investing in new technology and building much more nuclear? In short, negative environmentalists' opposition to nuclear has created a regulatory framework that unnecessarily increases costs. It surprised me to find out that many legacy environmental groups continue to oppose nuclear energy. Today, in 2024, the Sierra Club wants to shut down the entire nuclear fleet, 50% of U.S. clean electricity capacity. Just last week, Jane Fonda wrote in an op-ed in Pennsylvania about nuclear reopening in Pennsylvania that, quote, there isn't any room for renewables and nuclear in our energy future. This public pushback has led to unnecessary regulatory burdens that bring up the cost of nuclear. Thankfully, there's hope on the horizon for nuclear energy. It's specifically mentioned in the Republican platform, and while it isn't mentioned in the Democratic platform, President Biden has supported nuclear energy policy. And just last summer, the largest nuclear bill in years, the ADVANCE Act, passed the Senate 88-2, an overwhelming bipartisan margin. Ironically, the only two senators who opposed the bill were Senator Sanders and Senator Markey, perhaps the two most outspoken climate advocates in the Senate who still oppose safe 24/7 clean nuclear energy. Negative environmental opposition to nuclear is not a serious climate approach. Instead, we who care about climate and resource abundance should embrace a positive environmentalist vision and invite our friends on the negative environmental side to the same. Lean into innovation, building new clean energy, human stewardship, and the necessary efforts to remove government barriers for these projects. These are principles that many conservatives have believed for a long time, and many prominent figures on the left, like Ezra Klein, Matt Iglesias, and Democratic Congressman Scott Peters are leaning into today. If we move beyond outdated negative environmentalism towards positive environmentalism, the environmental future will be bright, bipartisan, and prosperous.
Thank you, Isaiah. It's great to see a fellow Dartmouth student or now alum going out into the world and doing good things in the area of climate. So really appreciate you joining us. We'll go last to Carlos, and then we'll dig into some Q&A.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carlos. I'm a graduate student at the University of Georgia, and specifically the Odom School of Ecology, and in the River Basin Center. I study how aquatic insects or macroinvertebrates can help us assess habitat quality in a stream that has multiple threatened and endangered fish and mussel species. I do my work in a stream called Holly Creek, Northwest Georgia, very rural agricultural area. We work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and Georgia Department of Natural Resources. But for me, I think it's been important that we also get private engagement. We have local landowners who let us use their land to be able to collect samples and to collect data every year for the past 5 to 6 years. So it reminded me, and it brought me back to growing up in rural Appalachia in North Carolina, where it's a biodiverse area, an area that would be scientifically rich area. But at that time and currently, there's little in the way of scientific interaction and much less in terms of conservation-focused policy in that area. And with only a fraction of the US's money being directed towards conservation explicitly, I think that getting the engagement from these groups of people in these areas is really important. But getting conservation funding towards these groups of people is not only important in rural areas where I grew up, urban environments are also key areas of focus. One avenue that I've thought about and have studied around is that every year we spend billions of dollars on infrastructure and transportation alone at all levels, federal, state, and local levels. And with so much money going towards new and updated infrastructure, my perspective is that there's a potential to combine other goals into this, specifically conservation, and with planning that would consider the environment and how people interact with the built environment. And tackling that in one goal, we would reduce the cost that it would take to do both things or either thing separately. Additional planning and the plan that would go with incorporating scientists and infrastructure, we would also tackle social problems that a lot of ethnic minorities and groups of lower socioeconomic standing have been the main targets of, low planning or less planning, lower funding. None of these infrastructure policies, though, could be done without them being properly done. Nowadays, with the way policy is being interpreted, I think it's more important than ever to be very explicit and very detailed about how we aim to incorporate science with the new built environment that we're creating so that it stands the test of time. We really can't afford to have these things be misinterpreted, that the new policies that come by stay for a while and that people support them for as long as possible. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. And thank you all for sharing. I mean, I think we're already just showcasing on this panel so many different ways that young people can get involved and be involved in this environmental issues in general, and especially in climate change. So really appreciate you bringing all your different perspectives. There's so much I would love to ask all of you, but we only have a bit of time. So I'm going to ask each of you one more question. If we end up going really speedily, we might be able to bring in some audience Q&A. So if you're in the audience, you can put some questions in the chat. We might have time. But we will, I want to begin with Georgie, and then we'll jump around a little bit. But Georgie, it was so cool to hear your story just now, because I've been following, first of all, the Held v. Montana case for a number of years, and I also recently wrote a series of articles about how climate change is affecting skiing here in New Hampshire. So there's so many questions I would love to ask you, but our time is limited, and I really wanted to focus on your experience as a plaintiff in that case. So signing onto a lawsuit against your state's government as a 17-year-old high school student, and then going out and testifying in a really contentious, nationally watched case, I think takes a lot of guts. And I'm wondering what it was that drove you to do this particular type of activism, what it feels like to be so deeply involved in this issue and to be in the spotlight the way that you are, and then what advice you would give to someone who maybe feels passionately about these issues but is scared to do something like sign on to a big lawsuit or testify in court. So if you can try to answer that in about 2 minutes, that would be wonderful, but really curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, B. So I think joining this case was kind of a little scary for me because I'm more of an introverted person, and especially back in high school, when I joined the case, I was definitely even more introverted. And the whole thing, which from like signing on to the case to getting deposed to testifying to doing media interviews and just kind of being in the spotlight, was definitely like a huge step out of my comfort zone. But I really got to learn a lot from being on this case, and I think really grow and learn a lot about the policy behind climate too. So that was really cool. But really, this all started for me with kind of one simple step, which was writing a letter to the editor. So that would kind of be my advice. Start with the simple steps that just kind of get you like maybe a little bit out of your comfort zone, because you never know where that step can take you. I think our voices really have power, which is something that this case really showed me. And speaking out in what may seem to be a small way can reach far more people than you might think. These sorts of things never really start big. There's always these small steps that can get you there and kind of build this up, kind of similar to what Senator Baucus was talking about earlier with that bottom-up growth. But yeah, so my advice is really find a way to speak up, or join an organization that you really resonate with, and just kind of go from there, because all those small steps will really add up. As for what drove me to this type of activism, really, I think it was a lot of frustration at kind of the changes I was seeing and hearing about, the science that was being ignored, the political division that was leading to inaction on this issue, and really feeling like I couldn't do anything in the face of the climate crisis. I really wanted a way to make a systematic change and fight for a livable future, not just for myself, but for everyone. I didn't fully know the entire scope of what this case would become, but I knew that if there was a way that I could help make a systematic change and fight for the rights of Montana youth, that I wanted to do it. So, thank you.
Thank you. And I love what you said about sort of finding something small that someone can do. It doesn't have to, you don't have to start with the lawsuit. They could start with the op-ed. I think that's really good advice. And Eric, I want to turn to you now. I loved hearing all of your passion for salamanders and how they're sort of the lens, the sort of smaller lens through which you're viewing this big issue of climate change. And something that I often hear from young people who care about this issue is just this sense of despair and feeling really, really overwhelmed by the enormity of the issue that is climate change. And I wonder if that's something that you experience in your work, and if so, what you recommend to other young scientists who are dealing with sort of these emotions and these feelings of being just overwhelmed by this issue, but also trying to tackle it in your day-to-day work.
Yeah, thanks, B. That's a really great question. You're right. It's really, really easy to get overwhelmed. Working in a field like this, seems like there's always an abundance of bad news and not a whole lot of good news, not a whole lot of success stories. And I absolutely run into that with my own work, especially working with amphibians. But I guess my advice to younger scientists would be to simply kind of focus on the good news, right? Look at the species that get removed from the endangered list. Read up on a lot of past successes and the process that led to those, like the discovery of acid rain, like the cap and trade system. Read books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and the resulting fallout, the curbing of pesticide use and DDT. I like to think that everyone on our previous panel here can attest to the fact that the large-scale issues, like the one we've been talking about, or the ones we're facing today, are not simply going to be solved in a day, as much as we all wish that were possible. It's the collection of little steps that you, me, this panel, and the thousands of other people around the world are doing each and every day that can kind of add up to a large and really tangible change. It's a lot like doing a PhD, right? You start off and get told, hey, 5 years from now, you should be able to produce an entire dissertation. Pretty much seems impossible at first, but you take a series of little steps, one after the other, and soon enough, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. But the thing is, the light was kind of always there. It might not be as visible on some days, but it was really never gone. The only way to really ensure that you never get there, that your project never gets to finish, is to give up. And so that would be my advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So I want to turn to Carlos next, because Carlos, you shared with us earlier that where you grew up in rural North Carolina, you felt like public policies weren't really geared toward conserving the natural world around you. And you spoke about the need for more science-informed environmental policy, and I know we heard that a lot in our first panel today. So you yourself are a scientist, you're in graduate school doing your own research, sounds like in a Georgia stream, and I'm wondering what avenues you've found or hope to engage with in the future to try to influence public policy so that it's better informed by scientists such as yourself.
Yeah. So I have a few ideas, but yeah, here in UGA, I was talking about involving science and infrastructure, and these are some ideas that people are writing about here. Charles Van Rees, Seth Wanger here, about changing the way that we imagine collaborating with civil infrastructure and creating more nature-based solutions. And you think about infrastructure, it's going to affect a lot of people, and it's going to affect people for a long time. So I think first and foremost, changing the way that science and also infrastructure interacts with the people that live in that region. Speaking from my perspective as a scientist, communicating with lay people and other stakeholders is a skill that isn't often practiced, but something that most scientists benefit a lot from. How to communicate with different levels of education, how to communicate with different people in different regions. So for me, and I think for other scientists, putting time into learning how to communicate with different levels of people to try to advance their ideas and to make sure that the people in that area know what's going on as well.
Great. Thank you for bringing us this thread of communication, because I think that's so important. And as young people, I think have such a voice that needs to be shared and needs to be communicated. I want to go on to Isaiah, who spoke earlier about, you spoke about your group, Isaiah, the American Conservation Coalition, and how they're demonstrating that conservatism and environmentalism are not oxymoronic. They can actually go together. And you told us about positive environmentalism is something that you think environmentalists on both sides of the aisle can get behind. And of course, the reason that we're here for an event centered around bipartisan environmental policy is because that kind of policy has gotten really, really hard to do. So I'm wondering, in your line of work, whether you've picked up any tips for having civil and meaningful conversations with people with whom you might disagree on some political issues, but who you think could be really valuable allies in achieving bipartisan climate solutions.
Well, it's a great question. And I think that question about how we have dialogue that's productive around climate and environment is going to determine what the future of environmental will be. So I'll just say off of the story. Just last week, I was back in Utah for Congressman John Curtis's Conservative Climate Summit. That was, it's pretty amazing that we're able to even do such a thing. But he outlined a vision of affordable, reliable, and clean energy in the future. And hopefully, I think those three principles are something that everyone can agree on. Everyone wants to leave the earth better than they found it, and we need to have affordable and reliable energy as well. And so I think that identifying that is really important going forward. On lands and wildlife conservation, this is something that everyone has engaged with, and particularly I think communicating to conservatives on this. You can talk around hunting and the heritage that's there, and the importance of ranchers and farmers and stewarding the land. And then on energy as well, I think it's really important to keep in mind what the goal is. So to get the clean part of affordable, reliable, and clean, we'll need like an all the above approach. I emphasize nuclear, but we're going to need lots of wind, solar, and even fossil fuels with carbon capture as well in the future. So being open to the ways to go forward and reducing emissions, I think is really important as well.
Great, thank you, Isaiah. So I want to turn to Dana next. And Dana, you gave us this really powerful story of seeing petrochemical plants near your high school's football field in Houston. And that's just such a chilling image. And you raised the connection between social justice and environmental issues. And this is a problem that's a hugely important topic. We've seen many environmental groups, I think, start to wrestle with and clue into that and more in recent years. I know I've personally heard a lot of talk about environmental justice within some of those groups, but I want to dig into some action steps. So I was wondering if you could give us some concrete ways that you think environmental concerns can be better addressed, either within environmental organizations or the scientific community, or both.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for such a great question, B. So there needs to be more thought on equity with environmental organizations, with creating or advocating for climate policies, or even when conducting science. And one way of doing this is by making sure that we are prioritizing vulnerable populations while pushing for environmental sustainability. And this could be by advocating for policies that address these systemic inequalities. Another way is uplifting their voices, listening to what marginalized communities have to say, making sure that they're being represented in these conversations, stakeholder engagement. Maybe this looks like public hearings, focus groups. Maybe this looks like an advisory board made up of local folks. Anything that will include them in the planning process. These movements, policies, and experiments should be a collaboration between these organizations, the policymakers, the scientists, and the community who will be impacted by these decisions. So overall, having this inclusive decision-making process. Something else that should be consistently incorporated within environmental organizations, the scientific community, and even policymaking could be equity assessments. Having these social equity assessments could help identify the potential impacts that certain decisions would have on vulnerable populations. So these assessments should evaluate things like the distribution of environmental benefits, the distribution of environmental burdens, economic impacts, health impacts across different groups that may potentially be caused by the proposed decision. If the assessments do reveal a disproportionate burden on certain communities, then there should be thorough thinking on mitigation strategies. So can we invest in infrastructure? What about grants aiming to reduce pollution? And last, but certainly not least, monitoring. So are they fully pulling through? If they move forward with said decision, how is the air quality data looking? What does the community think? Are the mitigation strategies working? Because if they're not, it can't just stop there. There needs to be opportunity for adjustment based on this feedback. There needs to be accountability and commitment throughout the entire process. So again, this inclusive decision-making process.
Thank you, Dana, so much. And thank you to all of our panelists for bringing your own unique perspectives to this panel. I think we're out of time for audience questions, unfortunately, but we do appreciate any questions you all sent in. And please keep them in mind and maybe reach out to the panelists afterwards to ask more. So everyone on this panel has given us so much to think about the role that science plays in public policy, the courage that it takes for young people to speak out about environmental issues that matter to them, and the goodwill that we need from people on both sides of the aisle to make meaningful policy change. So thank you all for your time. I look forward to seeing where each and every one of your journeys take you next. Thank you also to our organizers from the Emerging Climate Leaders Collaborative for making events like this possible and bringing young people into these important conversations. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob.
Thanks so much, Bea. Great program today. Once again, I'm Rob Werner. I'm the New Hampshire State Director for the League of Conservation Voters. So we've heard about the history. We've heard about what that means for today. And one of the things that I was reflecting on, and I think it's been maybe a bit of a blind spot in our sort of environmental NGO world, is that I think that we have missed an opportunity to pay respect to all that has gone before in terms of our energy systems. And what I mean by that is that we owe a real debt to those folks working in communities that have been built on sort of the extractive world, and to acknowledge that they built our economy. But now we know, for all the various reasons that we're aware of, that we have to do something different. But I think we do need to bring folks along and meet them where they are and really try to build trust in terms of investing in those communities and offering true opportunities for a new world, a new way of life, a new way to make a living, and a new way to build wealth. And I think we really need to pay attention to that. I speak from some experience with this because my spouse is the granddaughter of a coal miner from Northeast Pennsylvania. And while she's all in on the clean energy transition, she often reminds me about all that has come before. So let's try to meet people where they are and try to build a bipartisanship that way, try to build bridges. And as Lincoln said, let's try to appeal to the better angels of our nature. And I think we can get somewhere if we show each other respect and really try to listen to what other people are saying, what their perspectives are, what their experiences are, what their needs are, what their political experience are, what is going on in their communities, and how we can work together. Because we must find ways to move forward with bipartisanship so that we can save our democracy and preserve a healthy planet. We can meet the challenge of climate change, and we can do it in a way that's going to build economic opportunity in our communities and provide jobs for our citizens. So let's get to work. And again, let's try to build those bridges and meet people where they are and move forward together. Thank you very much for joining us today.